Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of our series How Do I Find My Way Through the Jungle of Culture. This video is directly related to the previous one, which was about Richard Dawkins. And for all of you who have seen the previous video and who remember the title, which was Richard Dawkins versus Germano-Grecian street philosopher. Maybe many of you were wondering about this title. Maybe some were wondering what a Germano-Grecian should be, and maybe others were wondering what a street philosopher could ever be. So about the Germano-Grecian, I will leave it like that. That's a new species that you will discover slowly. But I can enlighten you regarding to the street philosopher. A street philosopher is the equivalent of a street fighter. So, what's the difference between a street fighter and a street philosopher? Maybe you have noticed the difference is that the street philosopher can fight only with one glove because he needs the other hand to keep the mouse. Okay? So, let's continue our previous episode. And let's again occupy ourselves with Richard Dawkins, because I was feeling really a little bit sorry about what I said yesterday, especially when I was stating that his entire way of thinking was based on some ideas which he had when he was like in puberty, when he was like 14, 15, 16 years old, which was not taken out of my fantasy, but I had found this reference in an article on Wikipedia, and I would like to read this article again to you. Dawkins states, "The main residual reason why I was religious was from being so impressed with the complexity of life and feeling that it had to have a designer, and I think it was when I realized that Darwinism was a far superior explanation that pulled the rug out from under the argument of design, and that left me with nothing." Maybe I was too strict in the last video, but I said that actually Richard Dawkins comes to the conclusion that because the universe is incredibly complex and what he knows about God is very little, and the idea that he had made in his mind of God is too simple comparing to the complexity of the world. And as a 15, 16 years old boy, he comes to the conclusion, such a simple God, like I imagine, cannot create such a complex world as it is in front of my eyes, which I considered not a very mature thought, like, you know, a kind of, I don't know if it's even a thought. So, and then I said that his entire philosophical career is based on that childish thought. And when he found out later that there was this famous scientist called Charles Darwin with his famous evolutionary theory, which is relatively simple to understand. He said, wow, yeah, now I finally found something which is simple enough for me to understand. So that must be the way how the world has been created. Maybe I'm a little bit sarcastic, and that's why I want to give him a second chance. And while yesterday we read one of his first books, and the most famous one, The Selfish Gene, from 1976, today I want to read another book which was also very successful, which was published in 2006, and which is called The God Delusion. So without taking too much of your time, we will go directly to chapter 3, because in the start he just expresses again and again his disgust about religion, about religious people, about superstition, so-called superstition. So let's leave this and let's go directly to chapter number 3, where he goes into his best arguments, and he chooses to, let's say, debunk the most famous philosophers who had been trying to bring proofs for the existence of God, which, according to Richard Dawkins, are completely ridiculous. So he starts with one of the most famous Catholic philosopher, who was called Tommaso di Aquino, in English Thomas Aquinas. Aquino is a city in Italy. And this Tommaso di Aquino was also called, amongst many other names, Doctor Mirabilis, so the wonderful doctor, because of his wonderful way of thinking, of his magic intellect. But according to Dawkins, of course, this is all worth nothing, and he presents these proofs to us just to show us how childish and ridiculous people were in the past. So he starts with the first 3, and he says, the 5 proofs asserted by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century don't prove anything and are easily, though I hesitate to say so, given his eminence, exposed as vacuous. So nothing. It's all empty waste of time, actually. But as he needs to fill a book, he, let's say, spends a little bit of time to get into these arguments of Thomas. The first 3 are just different ways of saying the same thing, and they can be considered together. So, I mean, already he says Thomas is a total idiot. He could have written like one argument, but because probably also in those times the publishers were asking for more pages, he wrote like 3 arguments instead of 1. So he goes in number 1, the unmoved mover. Nothing moves without a prior mover. This leads us to a regress from which the only escape is God. Something had to make the first move, and that something we call God. Of course, these are the words of Richard Dawkins and not of Thomas Aquinas, but let's say it's about correct what he's saying. Second proof, the uncaused cause. Nothing is caused by itself. Every effect has a prior cause. And again, we are pushed back into regress. This has to be terminated by a first cause, which we call God. And number 3, the cosmological argument. There must have been a time when no physical things existed, but since physical things exist now, there must have been something non-physical to bring them into existence, and that's something we call God. So Dawkins, further on, he explains all three of these arguments rely upon the idea of a regress and invoke God to terminate it. They make the entirely unwarranted assumption that God himself is immune to the regress. So he wants to say it's an unwarranted assumption. It's not like an assumption without any base that God should be the initial point of creation. Why don't we ask who created God? That's what he wants to say. Okay, so who allows us to put an initial point, which is the limit, and to say that before that was nothing, or we cannot know what was before that initial point. This is pretty ridiculous, considering that natural science does exactly the same thing, putting as initial point of creation the Big Bang. And actually, further on in the text, it seems that while writing, he realized that science does exactly the same thing. And he says, to return to the infinite regress and the futility of invoking God to terminate it, it is more parsimonious to conjure up, say, a Big Bang singularity or some other physical concept as yet unknown. Calling it God is at best unhelpful and at worst perniciously misleading. So he wants to say, if we really need to go back to a primary cause, why should we call it God and not the Big Bang? Here you can see that he actually really did not understand the proofs, the first three proofs of Thomas Aquinas, which wanted to show that logic must necessarily lead you to an initial starting point. And the same logic that Thomas Aquinas is explaining is the same logic which works in every thinking person. And that's why science came to the conclusion of the Big Bang. Of course, science does not explain it like this. I mean, the Big Bang theory is supposed to be based on measurements that the universe is expanding, and as it is expanding, there must be an initial point in time in which the whole universe was like concentrated in one center, which then exploded. Also a very weird idea, why they put exactly an explosion at the start, as in real life we never observe that an explosion can lead to life. But obviously it's because they want to explain the following expansion. So this seems, the Big Bang theory seems not a logical conclusion, but something based on natural science. But maybe when they developed this theory, the scientists were led again by the same logic which Thomas Aquinas describes in his first three arguments. So, what's the problem of Dawkins related to Thomas Aquinas? I can tell you already at this point, his problem is that he does not consider thoughts to be a real thing. So Of course, it's his full right to have this opinion, and this opinion is not unknown to the history of philosophy. Actually, Thomas Aquinas was like one of the leaders of the philosophical discussion about this question, which was the famous battle between nominalists and realists. So, nominalists, with a few words, let's try to explain what it is. Nominalists say that our universal thoughts, like the dog, the horse, the cow, are just generalizations, are just abstractions from the actual reality. So after having seen like 100 different dogs, your mind has extracted, has abstracted, detracted, however you want to say it, some characteristics that all the dogs have, and in your mind you have made a universal idea what a dog is. But this is just a nomen, it's just a name. That's why it's called nominalism. It's just a name for a concept, for an idea, which does not exist anywhere in reality, because in reality you can find only specific dogs. You can find this dog and another dog, and each dog is a little bit different, and you will never see in your life the dog. So these are the nominalists, while the realists are insisting that concepts and ideas are more than just abstractions, that they have a real existence. The question during history of philosophy is only where do you find the idea of the dog? So in ancient Greece, Platon, he insisted there is a spiritual world, which he called the world of ideas, where you, if you can access to that world mentally, you will find the idea of the dog, the idea of the horse, and the idea of everything. His student Aristotle did not follow this teaching completely, but he came to a somehow more moderate conclusion, not denying completely what his teacher was saying, but he denied the existence of a separate world of ideas, and he was teaching that the, let's say, the concept, the idea of a dog is somehow connected with the real manifestation of the dog. So it's part of the real dog. So a dog that you see in front of you is at the same time a manifestation of the idea, but at the same time also a individual, unique animal. And Thomas Aquinas, who was rather a follower of Aristotle and not of Platon, he also continued with this kind of moderate realism, which still, although moderate, was in full contradiction with the school of nominalism. So you can already see from this that in those times the philosophers, who were the scientists of those times, were taking really seriously human thoughts. The funny thing is that after going through argument number 4 and 5 of Thomas, he comes with another philosopher who is called Anselm of Canterbury, and who lived a little bit earlier than Thomas, and who was also actually considered the founder of scholasticism. So he brings another proof of God, which was invented by Anselm. And let's see a little bit how this proof looked like. The ontological argument and other a priori arguments. A priori means proven from before, like from within your mind, not from sense experience. So it's actually the absolute opposite of natural science, which starts with an experiment and makes a posteriori conclusions, while a priori proofs start with thinking, and then you look around in the world if your thinking was correct. Science does this only on a second stage. So science first starts with experiment, then they make a theory. The theory is then treated like a priori argument, and then they try to verify the scientific theory again through further experiments, while the philosophers in older times were considering that there is the possibility of knowing something a priori just because it's logical and it cannot be proven because everybody just knows it's like that. So actually, even in our times, there's one science which behaves like this, which are mathematics. Because also in mathematics, there are some statements which are called axioms, which are considered undoubtedly true. So an axiom, that would be an a priori argument, but a priori arguments are not applied only to mathematical quantitative questions, but also to questions, for example, like religion or any other theoretical question regarding human life. And so not only quantity, but also quality. Arguments for God's existence fall into two main categories, the a priori and the a posteriori. Thomas Aquinas' 5 are a posteriori arguments, relying upon inspection of the world. The most famous of the a priori arguments, those that rely upon pure armchair ratiocination. So he means like actually a little bit what we do here, like sitting in your armchair and just thinking, is the ontological argument proposed by Saint Anselm of Canterbury in 1078 and restated in different forms by numerous philosophers ever since. An odd aspect of Anselm's argument is that it was originally addressed not to humans but to God himself in the form of a prayer. It is possible to conceive, Anselm said, of a being than which nothing greater can be conceived. Even an atheist can conceive of such a superlative being, though he would deny its existence in the real world. But, goes the argument, a being that doesn't exist in the real world is, by that very fact, less than perfect. Therefore, we have a contradiction and, hey presto, God exists. So, because he considers us not able to understand this argument, he starts to talk to us like if we were children. And he goes on, let me translate this infantile argument into the appropriate language, which is the language of the playground. Bet you I can prove God exists. Bet you can't. Right then, imagine the most perfect thing possible. Okay, now what? Now, is that perfect thing real? Does it exist? No, it's only in my mind. But if it was real, it would be even more perfect, because a really perfect thing would have to be better than a silly old imaginary thing. So I have proved that God exists. Ner, narny, ner, all atheists are fool. So actually he's trying to have some humor, which I don't deny. I was like laughing incredibly when I first read it, as now. What can we say about something like this? Of course, we could now go into like an infinite series of logical conclusions, and I say infinite because logic can prove anything. Logic is not actually the tool to prove something, and actually Richard Dawkins, in some way, he's right about this, that just empty words cannot prove if something is real or not. But the whole problem here is that he is discussing with the wrong guys, because he's bringing two examples. He's bringing Thomas Aquinas, and he's bringing Anselm of Canterbury, who were two leaders of the scholastic philosophical school. So let's see with whom he's actually trying to start a virtual discussion here, and why this discussion is so useless. So let's go to Wikipedia and check a little bit what scholasticism is. Scholasticism was a medieval school of philosophy that employed a critical organic method of philosophical analysis predicated upon the Aristotelian 10 categories. So, as I already said, these scholastics, they were rather fans of Aristotle, and particularly of the logic of Aristotle, because Aristotle, he dedicated a great part of his work to the studies of logic. So let's see what the 10 categories are. Categories. The categories is a text from Aristotle's Organon that enumerates all the possible kinds of things that can be the subject of the predicate of a proposition. So let's see if the categories are part of Aristotle's Organon. What is the Organon? The Organon is the standard collection of Aristotle's 6 works on logical analysis and dialectic. So let's try our luck and click a little bit on the word logical. This is the good thing about Wikipedia. You can go on and on and on, just find your way. Although most of the authors who write the Wikipedia are probably agreeing with Richard Dawkins, I fear. Still, you can use Wikipedia to find out certain things in a very easy manner, but never trust it 100%. Logic is the study of correct reasoning. It includes both formal and informal logic. Okay. Then they go very much into detail what all kinds of logic exist. So let's just see, we can click also the word reasoning. Reason. Reason is the capacity of consciously applying logic by drawing conclusions from new or existing information with the aim of seeking the truth. That's not a bad definition, right? So let's dig further on with the word information. Information is an abstract concept, as you can see. The nominalists definitely are the winners until now in history. Our thoughts are considered something abstract. This is the mainstream way of thinking. Information is an abstract concept that refers to that which has the power to inform. At the most fundamental level, information pertains to the interpretation of that which may be sensed. This is exactly what I described before, the basics of natural science. First, you need a sense perception, which can be enhanced by scientific tools. So if you cannot see something with your eyes, you build a tool which makes you see very far, or makes you able to see very small things. Telescope, microscope. And then you start to think about it. Interpretation, you start to explain what you just saw. But of course, what you develop when you do this is just abstract. They are abstract concepts. So you can already see that what Richard Dawkins is asking for when he's asking for a proof of God is a sense perception. He does not accept any proof which is based only on logic, because he is a continuation. His way of thinking, or rather not thinking, is a continuation of what we call nominalism. So he wants absolutely to have a sense perception. Otherwise, for him, a thought is completely useless, because it would be an abstract thought without any reality behind it. And that's why all this virtual discussion with Thomas Aquinas and Anselm of Canterbury is totally useless, and it's also totally useless for us to waste our time to get into this discussion, because if the guy doesn't accept the reality of thinking, why should we make so much effort to refute his thinking? So I think in a point a little bit later, he even admits this what I just said. I think, yes, I had taken some note before this video. So let me read from my note. Dawkins states, my own feeling to the contrary would have been an automatic deep suspicion of any line of reasoning that reached such a significant conclusion without feeding in a single piece of data from the real world. He wants data from the real world. Perhaps that indicates no more than that I am a scientist rather than a philosopher. Yes, my dear, that states exactly that you are a scientist rather than a philosopher. So I'm wondering why he is writing one philosophical book after the other. My question, sorry. So in the end, what's the conclusion? He wants a sense perception, he wants data from reality, but so what's the problem? Is there no data? Is there no data? Is it impossible to give the guy some data to make him happy? So there is like no proof of the existence of God around us. There's like nothing which could like give us some data about God. Actually, he is when he discusses the arguments of Thomas Aquinas, he also notices that there are data, but then he does not want to accept the data. For example, here he states, thanks to Darwin, it is no longer true to say that nothing that we know looks designed unless it is designed. Evolution by natural selection produces an excellent simulacrum of design, mounting prodigious heights of complexity and elegance. And among these eminences of pseudo-design are nervous system which, among their more modest accomplishments, manifest goal-seeking behavior that, even in a tiny insect, resembles a sophisticated heat-seeking missile more than a simple arrow on target. Here he's actually admitting that the most simple insect has a nervous system which is much more complicated than any human technology like a heat-seeking missile. And but for him, this is not a proof that anybody designed the insect, but he says it's just a simulacrum of design. It just seems like a design. Or he says also pseudo-design. So what more can we do? We give him like, and I think an insect is like really already a very complicated example. You could even take a small piece of grass. So just go to the most famous scientists of the world and ask them to produce out of the chemical elements the most simple plant, like a small grass. This is already not possible with all our technology and all our knowledge. We cannot create even the most simple plant. But while the most simple plant is more complicated than all our technology combined, he does not consider this a proof that the grass has been designed by someone, but he calls it a simulacrum. It just looks like a design. So how does he come to this conclusion? And here is the sad end of the video, I think. He comes to this conclusion again because of the same reasoning that he had when he was a 16-year-old boy, when he thought the world is far too complicated to be created by a being called God. Therefore, he's actually saying that because the nervous system of a insect is so much more complicated than the most sophisticated missile, while the missile needs a designer, the insect cannot be designed because it's too complicated. Nobody can do it. So let's say, unfortunately, the guy, after 30 years of thinking or not thinking and writing a lot of books about always the same content, has not made any progress. That's all for now. Goodbye. See you next time.